This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, C. Roberts, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, and B. Lupita. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and those of you who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversations on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke. Now, this week we are going to take another Kabbalistic turn. We had talked a bit about the three Canaanite deities. In the past, we have talked about Agrat Bat Malat, and who is a wife of Samael. And of course, a couple years ago now, probably maybe towards the very first year of Chthonia podcast, we talked about Lilith. And now we're going to be talking about another figure associated with Samael called Eisheth Zenunim. And Eisheth is not mentioned in too many places. The one place where we see her referred to is in the Zohar. So this is obviously a Kabbalistic text. So we are dealing with something that is not necessarily part of biblical canon or the Torah per se. There are said to be references to her in the Bible, as she seems to be connected not only with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, at least in some versions, but also with the whore of Babalon in the book of Revelation. Now, of course, there's a whole lot of complexity here that doesn't necessarily mean that Eisheth is the same as the whore of Babalon, although there are a number of tremendous similarities there. There is definitely, and the idea that her actual name means woman of prostitution, so not really a far stretch to equate her with the whore of Babalon. But it also must be remembered from previous podcasts, we've talked about the fact that Samael, who is sometimes connected to the serpent in the garden and sometimes connected to Satan, depending on which apocryphal texts you are looking at or which interpretations, although Samael is also an archangel and not necessarily said to be either, he's considered definitely to be an adversary of Archangel Michael, and is connected to these four wives that he has, are all considered to be prostitutes. And Samael, like Eisheth and Lilith, are all associated with an aspect of Kabbalah known as the Qlippoth. And I want to talk about all of these things because it's not always entirely clear who Eisheth is and the way that she is interpreted in esoteric thinking. She tends to be associated Kabbalistically with two different Sephirot, or two different Qlippothic flip side of the Sephirot, and they're both from very different parts of the tree, but both, as I think I'm hoping to show, they tend to in their own ways, maybe in a higher and a lower sense, represent the same type of thing. So I want to get into what all of her associations and correspondences are, because again, she's not really mentioned in too many places. If you were to actually look her up online, and let's say you were going to go into Wikipedia and look her up, it would redirect you to Whore of Babalon and would decide that that's what she is connected to. But and certainly Crowley seems to, his idea of Babylon to at least some degree seems to come from Eisheth as she is represented. So what I would like to do is go over what her associations are, what she is said to look like, and then we're going to look at the different stories that we see biblically that are said to be associated with her, although again, it's not always clear that she is the one being referred to in these stories. There are some other interpretations that do exist. Then we're going to talk about her as the the personification of sin, which is also the way she has been described, the female personification of sin, how she connects in with this role of one of the 4 prostitutes that we hear spoken about connected to Samael. And also, and I think most importantly, we want to look at her Kabbalistic correspondences, because it's in Kabbalah that she primarily appears. I'm going to go along as we are talking about this, and I will explain these different pieces as best I can. I think outside of certain initiatory contexts, not everything's going to make sense to the person who is not involved in those systems, but I'm going to try to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible. And I think I say that with the caveat because to those of you who actually listen to this, who have more of a knowledge of the esoteric background of this and of the Kabbalah, at least as the esoteric Kabbalah, how it's used that way, some of the things that I'm saying here may seem too simplistic. But my goal here is not to get too heavy duty into those correspondences and symbolisms as they would relate to somebody who is an initiate of one of the Western systems, whether you're talking Golden Dawn, whether you're talking OTO, whether you're talking one of the, or even one of the, in thinking about some of the Luciferian type of traditions that have, that look more at the Qlippothic influences. So we're not necessarily looking to delve very deeply into that, because obviously the thing I'm the most interested in is Eisheth as a dark feminine figure, and what exactly does that mean, and how does she connect with some of these other figures that we're seeing from the similar cultural basis and background that we had seen before. Okay, so let's start with talking about what Eisheth is supposed to look like. Okay, so she is described as having, it's rarely described, but it says she's a figure in decorative robes made of pure golden material, wearing a 6-pointed sun crown on her head, a beautiful woman with goat feet. Okay, so already when you have the idea of a beautiful woman with animal feet, we have seen this in fairy lore in particular, and you have this idea here that this is a woman, usually a woman who has more of a vampiric or a succubus kind of attribute to her, when you see this idea of a woman who has the feet of an animal, because of course those goat feet or any kind of animal feet are this bestial implication to it. It's more connected to lust than it is to whatever that ideal of the feminine is supposed to be in her creative function. Can be either way. Now it's interesting because the titles she's given here, and this is in the esoteric blog, it says that she's either the succubus crone, the demon queen, or the bride of Samael. Now, the idea of her as a crone is interesting. I have also seen her listed. She's had other descriptions in other places. I don't think that's the only one. I've seen her heard about her as wearing robes of bright purple. So there's certainly a regal element to her, and being kind of loaded with precious jewels. So she has this element of just being this very, very beautiful woman. Someone else had described her as having not only that, but having red hair and white skin with very red lips, like this personification of the beautiful redhead, as it were. And it's also said that in Jewish mythology, she is said to eat the souls of the damned. I thought I might throw that in there. But I think the idea of her as an eater of souls is also relevant. So what we want to talk about here, I think what I would like to start in talking about her is to actually look at the text from the Zohar that talks about Eisheth Zenunim. I always want to add a syllable there that doesn't belong there. But that is that. So we're going to talk about how she is interpreted in the Zohar, chapter 1, 5a. And this text was actually provided. There is a blog called Brightest and Best 666 at WordPress that actually provided the text for this. So I want to thank the person who posted this, because it's easier than me trying to find another copy of the Zohar. I used to own a copy of the Zohar, and I don't actually have it anymore. So this way I was just able to pull this up without having to hunt around for another edition. Okay, now there's something here I just want to mention is that there's a reference to Isaac's light, and I believe they're referring to Rabbi Isaac Luria. And Luria is one of the ones in his Kabbalistic writings that makes reference to Eisheth Zenunim. So let's read what this says, first of all. A deep mystery is found in the strength of Isaac's light, of holiness, and from the dregs of wine, which are Qlippoth. Okay, let me stop there for a minute. Qlippoth is actually a word that means a shell or husk, and it refers to the flip side of the tree of life. If you are not familiar with the tree of life, in the YouTube version of this, I will have an illustration of it. It looks like a tree that has 3 pillars and basically 10 circles on it, which are known as sephirot. And they represent the emanation from nothingness down to what they call malkut or kingdom. So it's basically the idea of moving from spirit into the material world. And then, of course, the tree goes in both directions. And then there is a flip side of the tree that has what is considered to be the forces of evil, or the Qlippoth, which are the husks. And the way that the idea of the husk is interpreted is different depending. Some people say it's just the husks. It's often interpreted as the husks in which contain holiness within. So it's almost like the shell of a nut, that you have to crack it open to get to the essence within it. Others say these are the shells or husks of primordial beings or primordial, sort of like the leftover dregs or dross of the universe, the filth that's left over. Shells of beings that used to exist, shells of the dead. This is certainly the way the Golden Dawn tends to describe it, and that the Qlippoth represent these shells or these husks. So they're really just sort of empty shells of things that are left around, and they represent impurities. So they sort of clog up the works of the sephirot potentially. Because the tree has the 2 sides to it, these shells or these husks are also part and parcel of what they consider to be the emanations of the divine. So we'll talk about what that means. Some people call the Qlippoth the tree of death, just as the other's the tree of life, but these two are not separate from each other. They are flip sides of each other. Okay, so we're going to get more into what the Qlippoth is in a moment. One shape emerged from both, made of good and evil, male and female, as one. It is red as a rose and extends to many sides and paths, having many aspects. The male is called Samael, and the female is always included with him. As on the side of holiness, Zer Anpin, and Nukva are always included one within the other. So it is on the other side. A male and female are included within one another. Okay, let's stop for a minute. Zer Anpin. This is a emanation that is supposed to be associated with the with Tiferet, which is the sephirot that is right in the middle of the tree of life. Tiferet is beauty, and it is an emotional sephirot that is connected to this sort of the Shekinah, the indwelling feminine divine presence within creation. Okay, and that's Nukva. Nukva is the indwelling Shekinah. She's the feminine. Zer Anpin is this sort of masculine other part of it that is united with Nukva. So it says in medieval Kabbalah, the sin of Adam, as well as later sin, introduces apparent separation perceived from creation between the two, bringing exile and constriction on high. The task of man is restoring union to the male and female divine manifestations. Okay, so this is uniting Zer Anpin with Nukva. These beautiful male and females that are supposed to be united sort of in this central point that is Tiferet, that is associated with that. Because Tiferet is that center point of the tree that connects the upper and the lower parts of the tree. The upper part being more what you might say is spiritual essence, and the lower part having more to do with with mind, consciousness, and the material side of things. So we'll talk about that a little bit more at length as well. Okay, so back to our text, but I just wanted to... So what they're saying here is just as there's Zer Anpin and Nukva, who are this masculine, divine masculine and feminine that need to be reunited in Tiferet, so on the reverse of the tree, there is also a couple that is united, which is Samael, and in this case, some interpretations, I think certain Luciferian interpretations say it's Lilith, but in this case, they were saying this would actually be Eisheth, would be the one who is united here with Samael. A male and female included within one another. Okay, back to this. The female of Samael is called a serpent, a wife of harlotry, which is what Eisheth literally means, the end of all flesh, Bereshit, verse 6:13, and the end of days. Two evil spirits cling together. The illumination of the spirit of the male is a thin light, namely, only the 6 extremities without the head. Okay, so this is a headless being. Again, those of you who are esoteric practitioners, that would make sense. The spirit of the female materializes in many ways and paths, being an entire parts of head and body, for in the Qlippoth, the female is larger than the male. Okay, that's interesting. So the female dominates the Qlippoth, or she has more. So this is almost like you have this headless figure, but then you have the full-bodied figure of the female who dominates the male in this particular one, or she's at least larger than the male. She cleaves to the spirit of the male, wearing ample jewelry like an abominable whore, standing on main roads and pathways to seduce men. This teaches us that she values only those who start walking the path of Hashem and are apt to fall into her trap. Now, what is Hashem? Okay, well, if you're not familiar with Judaism, Hashem is a word that is frequently used instead of Yahweh. We use that word very indiscriminately outside of Judaism, but it's considered to be a holy, the Yod He Vav He is considered to be the holiest name of God. So frequently you do not refer to God by that name. You refer to God as Adonai or as Hashem. Okay, so this is a representation of that name without saying that name. So the path of Hashem is the path of Yahweh, basically. Therefore, she is viewed as standing at the main, literally the start of the road to Hashem's devotion. But for those who are accustomed to the ways of Hashem, the whore is separated from them and has no power over them. Okay, so this is the idea that the spiritual seeker who goes on the road or the path of Hashem or Yahweh, who starts on the path of the Lord, shall we say. The person who starts on that path, that they can be tempted by the appearance of Eisheth, okay? And that's going to make sense in a Kabbalistic sense as well, as we're going to see, in terms of where we find Eisheth on the Tree of Life, which is listed as being 2 different places. So we'll get back to that. When a fool approaches her, she holds and kisses him, and she pours him wine full of dregs and snake's venom. Okay, so dregs, what are we thinking of? Doesn't actually dregs. Doesn't that remind me of like grappa? Like, it's literally the bottom, like all the silt and stuff at the bottom of the wine cask, which is promoted in certain places actually as a kind of delicacy. But and the venom of the snake, okay? And so the idea of the venomous does take us back to Samael, who literally means, which is often interpreted, the name's often interpreted as poison of God. So this venom of the snake, although Samael himself, again, is not considered to be the snake in this view. But anyway, I'll move on. After he drinks, he whores after her. When she sees him whoring after her and turning from the path of truth, she removes all the decorations she put on for that fool, as will be explained. That's not me saying it this time, that's the text. Her seductive features include her hair, which is red as rose, and her face, which is white and red. Yes. In her ears there are 6 earrings of Egyptian fabric. On her neck hang all the powers of eastern lands. Her mouth is decorated by a small slit of a comely shape. Her tongue is as sharp as a sword. Her speech is as smooth as oil, and her lips as beautiful and red as a rose. Wearing purple and having 40 decorations less 1, okay, 39 decorations, okay. She is sweeter than all that is sweet in the world. The fool follows her, drinks of her wine, and fornicates with her. What does she do? She leaves him sleeping in his bed, goes up to denounce him, and receives permission to kill him. She then descends on him. The fool wakes thinking of lusting after her, as before. At this point, she has taken off the decorations and has become a mighty oppressor who wears a garment of burning fire that causes great horror and frightens the body and soul. That oppressor has horrible eyes and a sharp sword on which there are bitter drops. The oppressor kills the fool and throws him into Gehenna. Gehenna being the fiery pit. Okay, so much to unpack here. Okay, so let me talk also about other 2 potential associations with Eisheth. And I'm saying potential because it's not necessarily explicit. There is some disagreement about who is being represented by these figures, but it's worth mentioning these stories because I think it fits into the broader context here. One has to do with the Garden of Eden, as I mentioned. I was going back to that story lately. It just seems to be going back to Adam and Eve and to what we call the original sin of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, in some interpretations, the serpent that comes and tempts Eve is Satan. But we must remember, of course, that the term Satan is the idea of a role, an adversarial role, not necessarily the name of a being. Later on, Satan becomes the name of a being, or is interpreted as such. But Satan, like Samael, is considered to be the angel who is the head of the Satans, as it were. Satans appear frequently throughout the Old Testament. Anytime you see an angel with either a sword, a fiery sword, or standing in some kind of warlike or opposing fashion to somebody or what somebody is trying to do, that figure is acting as a Satan. Okay, they are an obstructor. They are the one that's there to stand in the way of somebody doing something. And we don't see this role really developed until we see the idea of in the book of Job, where we literally see the Satan who wanders through the world, who is often identified with Samael, but actually has another name as well. This particular adversary speaks to Yahweh and says, and actually Yahweh points Job out to him and says, "Hey, look at my servant, isn't he awesome?" And he's like, "Betcha I can make him curse you." And Yahweh's like, "Okay, you're on." So this is an adversary in the sense of somebody who's coming to test you. But this person's always coming on behalf of God. Okay, this person is the Satan role, at least in this initial way of thinking about it in the Old Testament, is somebody who acts as an opposer, not somebody who is not this personification of ultimate evil that people tend to think of later on. Okay, so that's one interpretation here of Samael. When Samael is referred to as speaking to Eve in the garden, when we do hear Samael referred to in the texts, not necessarily Genesis, but in other texts that are other apocryphal texts, they would call them, that are connected to this, Samael is riding on a serpent. Samael is not the serpent, but rather riding on the serpent, like one would ride a camel, is the way it's described. And in riding this serpent actually has feet too, so it's almost more of like riding on almost like a dragon type figure. So whether it's Samael or whether it's the serpent who speaks to Eve, or Samael riding on a serpent, then you have this idea of, oh no, you can eat of the tree. And of course, in this sense, we are talking about bringers of death, because as soon as you eat from the tree, you move outside the field of eternity and into the field of time. And once you do that, now you experience death. So we have this idea of Samael riding what might be Eisheth. There's other versions that suggest that Samael might have been riding on Asherah. That has also been discussed as a possibility. And perhaps there are some other theories as well about the serpent. What we do know from Genesis is that Yahweh says that the serpent shall crawl on its belly. Whether we think it's the serpent alone, acting alone, or Samael or whoever riding on a serpent, whichever it is, we definitely have this idea of the serpent then crawling on its belly. And that implies that the serpent wasn't crawling on its belly before, that it had legs of some kind. So there's this idea of the serpent now just having to crawl along on its belly rather than having legs or feet of any kind, feet, arms, whatever, to support it. So some say that this is Eisheth, represented as this serpent. Now, the other representation that we see of Eisheth would be, as I mentioned, the whore of Babalon. So now we look at the book of Revelation. So how is the whore of Babylon represented there? Well, again, she's a woman very similarly attired in the way that she's described, wearing the jewels, and she's drunk on the blood of the saints. Okay, now that's also an important thing to think about here, as we will see. And she rides on the back of the beast, the great beast who is identified with 666. 666 is really a solar number, and makes a reference to the sun, as there are many other permutations that also reference that kind of solar way of thinking. And it's interesting too, because a lot of what later became Christianity became associated with solar theology. I mean, you already have solar theology in the cult of the 12, right? The 12 Olympians. Before that, there was the cult of the 12 in the Hittite religion. And we see 12s in all kind of places. 12 apostles, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 imams of Islam, 12 gates of Jerusalem, 12, I mean, you can think of all the 12s. And of course, 12 months in a solar year. So hence we have this solar association. And certainly with the development of Christianity as a religion of empire, you certainly have the connection between the idea of Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun, which was associated with the emperor, as later becoming associated with Jesus Christ as the unconquerable sun. So Jesus ends up taking on a lot of this solar theology, which seems interesting, maybe contradictory to some people, except you have to recognize that Revelation was written by John of Patmos, who actually was opposed to, he wasn't opposed to Jesus Christ, but he was opposed to Gentiles becoming part of Christianity, because at that point it was considered a sect of Judaism, and he felt like all these uncircumcised people coming in and joining in that Paul brought in were not okay. And of course, he refers to Paul. He makes a coded reference to Paul as a deceiver in Revelation for this reason. So, yeah, he's not necessarily on board with that way of thinking. So, but the great beast here is the one that, and the whore of Babylon rides on the back of the beast. That is also interesting, because first we see if we are talking about the same being, or at least references to be similarly aspected beings that are referred to as queens of prostitution or whores or whatever, and one being the wife of Samael that he is riding, and a wife of Samael, because his wives are all considered to be prostitutes, kind of falls into very similar veins. And yes, we see connections with Lilith, Agrat Bat Malat, and then also there's another one called Nama, who is also based on another Babylonian figure that predates her. There's definitely there's this idea of these wives of Samael who are all prostitutes. And then we have this idea of the whore of Babylon. Okay. So in one story, in the creation story, it's, if you want to think of Samael as the kind of, if people associate the B666 with this satanic figure, okay, we're just going more to popular mainstream ways of thinking about it. Then if we think of Samael as first riding the beast, and then Samael acting as the beast and being ridden by the whore. So first he rides the whore, and then the whore rides him. Okay, and again, there's people who are going to object and say, no, they're not exactly the same. Yes, I'm well aware of that, but it's more of the idea that you have this female bride/prostitute figure who is first acting as the serpent that is ridden, and then later this kind of prostitute figure who is now riding on the back of a beast. Okay, so it's almost like one happens at the beginning. Well, if you're going to think of it in terms of that theology, it's one fall and then it's the second fall, really. But one happens at the creation of life as we know it, which requires death. I mean, you don't really have life without death. That's really one of the great mysteries. You have all of this, and we talk about the field of immortality versus the field of mortality. You don't have life without death. So there's this idea of life coming into being, and if we're looking at literature that's apocalyptic and has to do with the end of the world as we know it, to quote REM, then you're almost talking about almost a creative, destructive kind of element, but it's that aspect of creation that makes us say, should life have ever been? It's that suffering element that we see to life. Because when Adam and Eve are ejected from the garden, this becomes the start of suffering, and allegedly this has to do with sin, which also might explain Eisheth's connection as the personification of sin, female personification of sin. Okay, so those are the two. I mean, again, I'm not going to call them stories of Eisheth exactly. They are stories that have figures that could possibly be referring to Eisheth, because they are talking about a woman who is a prostitute in some way, or is like kind of literally her name meaning woman who is of harlotry or woman of prostitution. And these are both cases where that reference has been made. And as we can see, it's explicitly made in this particular text from the Zohar. And again, those of you who are not familiar with Kabbalah, this is a form of Jewish mysticism that came into being really around, I would say, the Middle Ages, probably 12th century, roughly, is sort of the time period that we see a lot of these texts. I have talked about Kabbalah in other podcasts that I've done, And of course, there's the Kabbalah that is practiced by Jewish rabbis and by particularly in Orthodox Judaism. And typically, you are not the only people who are allowed to practice Kabbalah are rabbis who are over the age of 40 and generally only men. Generally, Kabbalah is not something that is taught to women. I mean, that may have changed, but certainly within Orthodoxy, that would not have changed. It's the idea that is a kind of almost a secret knowledge that is retained for those who would have been the equivalent sort of a lifetime being a rabbi. Kabbalah is also, of course, used in Western esotericism in the same way that certain aspects of Hinduism and alchemy and other things are also used in Western esotericism, which is kind of a mishmash of these kinds of things. Now, when we think about Kabbalah, there's been a lot of writing and thought on Kabbalah from a lot of different angles. And if we think about it in terms of the esoteric societies, certainly a lot of the initial stuff written in the West was written by the Order of the Golden Dawn. So we're looking at S.L. MacGregor Mathers, we're looking at Israel Regardie, and their writings where they are talking about the teachings from Golden Dawn about the Kabbalah. Dion Fortune also writes about it as well. And not much is said about the Qlippoth. The Qlippoth is something that is mentioned. There's an essay when you read, if you have the big book O Golden Dawn Rituals that was put out. Regardie has a footnote referring to another text that specifically addresses the entities of the Qlippoth, but it's in a different place. They don't include it as part of that. Presumably, there's not a whole lot of reference to the Qlippoth because they don't really want initiates delving into that. And then, of course, Crowley has his own interpretations in 777 and in other places of the forces of the Qlippoth. There's some differences in how they are interpreted. But the main thing we want to think about here is the Tree of Life. And the Tree of Life, again, is these 10 Sephiroth, 11 if you count the abyss in the middle, the invisible Sephiroth of Da'at. And the Sephiroth are, just to make things clear, they start from 1 to 10. You have, well, first of all, above those, you have the emanations, the limitless light, the Ein Sof, or the Ein Sofer, the limitless light. And from that emanation comes the crown, which is known as Keter. That's the first Sephiroth. And then it's almost like it's a divine essence that flows from one Sephiroth to another, and it kind of pools in this one, representing these different qualities of the Tree of Life. And so it will first moves to what would be its left, then it moves to the right, and then it kind of almost goes zigzag diagonally down the tree. There is a middle pillar. There are center points where these things meet together. And then, of course, the very bottom emanation of the tree is where we live. It's known as Kingdom, or Malkut. And so Keter is the first one, Chokmah is the second, Binah is the third, Hesed is the fourth, Geburah or Gevurah is the fifth. And then we move over to Netzah and Hod, which are Venus and Mercury opposite each other respectively. And then you have Yesod, and then below Yesod you have Malkut. Okay, and I'm sorry, I completely left. It's funny, I left Tiferet out. Basically, so when you go from Gevurah, then you go to Tiferet, and then from Tiferet you move to Netzah and then to Hod. Okay, so there's this path, and there's 22 pathways. There's a whole, it's a whole system. But yeah, so those you have these 10 Sephiroth, and really what they are set on is 3 pillars. There's a pillar that, with you looking at the picture, the pillar on the left is called the pillar of severity, and the one on the right is called the pillar of mercy. Now, of course, if you think about the Tree of Life as representing a human body, then facing you, then obviously the pillar of mercy would be the left side, and the pillar of severity would be the right. And the middle pillar runs down the middle, obviously. When we're talking about this force that's called Eisheth, okay, where are we talking about this as residing? Well, okay, you've got these 10 Sephiroth, and then if you flip the tree over, you have the Qlippoth, okay? So it's literally the same, it's like if you had a front and a back to the same tree. So the back of the tree here, it has to do with the 10 Sephiroth that are associated with what we think of now as demonic forces. And these, and so they represent what, they're called the husks or the shells, the Qlippoth. Which, so there's the implication there that they are the things that are holding the divine emanation that you see in the front. So they're almost the backdrop to it. It's almost like this primordial stuff that's there. And the way it's often described, when I was reading Regardie on this, he talks about it as talks about this astral light, this great light that also contains the filth of the Qlippoth. So it's got both good and evil. But my problem with the way Golden Dawn couches a lot of it, again, is the fact that it becomes like, well, this is the good part and this is the evil part. This is the thing you must triumph over or overcome. And again, it still falls into that very split way of thinking that I don't think is helpful if you're really trying to use magical operations for any kind of purpose, even for the Kabbalistic purpose. If the purpose is to unite the masculine and the feminine within the tree of life, if this is what Luria is talking about with Kabbalah, then you're not going to do it by assuming that one piece is good and one piece is evil and one has to be overcome. Mathers has his own views on this, S.L. McGregor Mathers. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't to me, but in any case, when we look at Eisheth, she of course is going to belong to that flip side of the tree, and she is often associated, I've seen her name associated with one of two places. She's either associated with Satariel, which is the Qlippothic Sephiroth that is basically the reverse of Bina. And she's also associated with, with Gamaliel, which is the one that is considered to be the flip or the reverse of Yesod. Okay. Now, if you look at the Tree of Life, these are two totally different places. Bina is technically the third emanation. I mean, if you want to say Keter's the first, Chokmah, which is wisdom, is the second, and Bina represents understanding. Bina is also has a kind of divine mother aspect to her. If Chokmah is wisdom, this sort of divine wisdom that comes not necessarily through thinking and rationality and thought, then Bina would represent understanding. In other words, being able to consciously be aware and to understand something. Okay, that would be Bina. And Bina is also, in this motherhood sense, is associated with creation. She has this motherly aspect that the energy from Keter and Chokmah then can become manifest in this world through Bina, okay, through this divine understanding. And that sounds kind of odd, thinking of Bina in that way, in this very rationalistic way, because we don't tend to think of the feminine as rational, right? And she is the top of the pillar of severity, as the word Bina is associated with, I've heard it has an association with bitterness, among other things. And, so there's definitely this rather severe quality to Bina. And right underneath her on that is Gevura or Gebora, which is associated with Mars. And Bina, by the way, is associated with Saturn. And then underneath Gebora, you have Hod, which is associated with Mercury. So she's on this very, very rationalistic, left-brained kind of aspect of the Tree of Life, which makes sense if you consider that in the Judaic system, and also within Christianity, that the creation of the world, the creation coming out of the void, starts with words. It starts with logos. It starts with words. God says, "Let there be light." Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh." Right? It's the Word. It's logos that is what creates the universe in this view, which is not necessarily the view of other world mythologies, but that is certainly the Judaic view. That is certainly the biblical view, that things come from logos. So the idea that Bina would represent that very primal intellectual understanding, the idea of creation through word. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense to have Bina there. Now, those who are Thelemites know that Bina, if those who believe it see Bina as being connected to Babalon, which makes sense, okay, because again, if she is associated with Satariel, that particular Qlippoth region, if we see Eisheth as being associated with that Sephiroth, then we see the idea of you've got the mother and the whore kind of like on reverse sides of each other. And also within Thelema, there's the idea that if the initiate is moving from Malkut, which is the bottom of the tree, and moving back up, there's some esoteric societies, like Dion Fortune will say, well, nobody goes beyond Tiferet. Tiferet is like that center point that one is trying to reach to unite the upper and the lower, and that one doesn't move beyond that. There are certainly other systems that suggest one does go beyond that, but you have to worry about crossing the abyss, which is right above Tiferet. It's like if Tiferet's the mountaintop, Tahat, which is in front of it, is like the abyss that you can fall into. And people do fall into the abyss when they start thinking that they are, when they reach that Tiferet point and think, how would have Joseph Campbell put it? What a good boy am I? You reach that point where you think, look at me, I'm so awesome. Look at everything I know. I'm like a messiah figure here. And then you fall right down. So That's the whole idea, because when you reach that point, when you are moving away from Malkut back towards Keter, you're moving towards dissolution. The movement from Keter to Malkut is actually the idea of incarnation. Then the other is obviously a process of dissolution. So by the time you reach Bina, Crowley does connect her with the whore of Babylon, because she is quote unquote drunk on the blood of the saints. And who are the saintly? The saintly are the ones who have left their ego behind, who successfully crossed the abyss, but then it's a matter of the crushing of your ego or the crushing of your identity. Crushed like a bunch of grapes. And, you are the wine that is drunk by Babalon, okay, by Bina at that particular level. So there is this dissolution or crushing of the ego. So in this sense, Bina is both creation and destruction. She is the power of creation and, manifestation in the world, and also has to do with that final stages of dissolution that can occur. Of the identity, let's just say the egoic identity and who that whatever it is that you identify with in the world. So in this sense, we could see Eisheth as the reverse of Bina, in the sense that we are dealing with the sort of the sacred prostitute in that regard. And Eisheth potentially, now Eisheth, though, in the Kabbalistic system, tends to represent an obstacle, right? What we just read in the Zohar is that the person who is on the path of Hashem, which in theory, if you're talking about Kabbalah as being an aspect of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalist would then be in theory on the path of Hashem, right? So what ends up happening is you can see it, but there's also aspects of it that don't quite fit in. It's a little bit of shoehorning the shoe into your foot into the shoe that may or may not quite fit there. I think there are aspects of that do fit. Probably the one that makes a little more sense overall is the association of Eisheth with Gamaliel, at least according to the Zohar text that we've just read. Now, if we go back to that, so if we go back to our Qlippothic deities, Malkut, which is the 10th Sephirot, is associated with Lilith, in the Qlippoth. And the one directly above it is the realm of Gamaliel. Now, there's some, like I said, some Luciferian groups, I have seen this version of the Qlippoth that puts Lilith in Gamaliel. Okay, and that's not completely irrational, because Lilith has to do, she's a succubus queen, a prostitute queen, and she is the wife, she's considered to be the wife of Samael, the bride of Samael. And Samael is associated with the Qlippoth that is the flip side of Hod, or intellect. Okay, so that's Mercury. So the idea that Hod is connected to Yesod, and the two of them, it says in the Zohar that the male and the female, cleave to each other, and that they're together. So if Samael is considered to be Hod, then that they would actually be, Mars would actually be in between him and Bina. If Eisheth is actually the flip side of Bina. So you would actually have a whole Sephirot in between the two of them. So if they're actually together, it makes more sense that they'd be together, Hod and Yesod together. And of course, as we'd mentioned, that flip side, Zir Anpin and Nuk, I'm saying that correctly, right? Nukva, yeah. I have to make sure I don't transpose letters here. That they are actually the divine masculine and feminine. They are also associated with Tiferet, which is the Sephirot right above it. Yeah, I mean, it would make sense then if you've got the male and female as like Tiferet and Yesod together as well. I mean, there's this idea of this divine pair that are right near each other. Yesod is the sphere of the moon. It's the sphere of intuition, and it is directly above Malkut. And if Malkut is the kingdom that we live in, then Yesod is that moonlight. And the symbolism of the moon, at least in esoteric thinking and certainly in divinatory thinking, is that the moon casts a false light. In other words, it's reflecting sunlight, but the light of the moon can be deceptive. You're still kind of walking around in darkness, and what you see by moonlight may not be what it appears. So there's kind of almost a deceptive quality to it, and at the same time, it does represent that knowing that is not of things that are not illuminated by the sun, right? The things that we get through our intuition and so forth. Whereas Hod represents the intellect. So if on the flip side there we have Samael with Eisheth, if Eisheth is the ruler of Gamaliel, okay, and again, Gamaliel also has to do, it's supposed to be the lust of the Qlippoth, like all of the earthly desires of those discarded husks or shells that have, gathered in, pooled in this one particular Sephirot, which is the flip side of the moon. The moon Sephirot, the Yesod Sephirot. So you could see there where, again, you've got that divine pair in that part of the tree. Okay, but around Yesod, Tiferet, Hod, around that lower part of the tree, that section that's above Malkut, but is not in the upper part of the tree. You have all of those kind of together there, and again, in the Zohar, it's telling us that just as Zer, Anpin, and Nukva are a pair that stay together, although they are separated. The separation of them, this drawing of the veil or the separating them is what creates the problem. That split between masculine and feminine, and that these two need to be reunited. Similarly, if you have Samael and you have Eisheth, if she is a bride of Samael on the reversed side, and if that particular Sephirah is the personification or the Qlippothic accumulation of lust and of this kind of primordial lust in this aspect that is part of the what they consider to be the filth of the universe. Now, remember also we had talked about filth last week with respect to Echidna, the Greek, as kind of primal Greek goddess who's associated with also with the serpent and with rot and with filth and with things like that. And so we have this sort of idea here with this Qlippothic idea and in this personification of lust, who also appears sometimes in the form or connected to the form of the serpent. So it's interesting. So you have you have Samael and you have Eisheth at this level, and again, sometimes interchanged with Lilith. Lilith is another wife of Samael. Okay, so it's not crazy or outrageous to put Lilith there. But if we think of Eisheth as that particular being, if that's the one that's referred to here in the Zohar, then I feel like that's a very sensible place for her, because Yesod also has to do, it would make sense given what the text is. So if the person is initially on the path, somebody, remember they say very specifically, people who are on the beginning of the path of Hashem, people who are at the beginning of that path are then set upon by Eisheth. Okay, so think about it. If the path begins with Malkut, for those of us who are here in this world, then the first thing you're going to encounter is the Sephirot of Yesod, of the moon. That's the first thing that you're going to see directly above you. And on the one hand, that's the path that's not quite illuminated yet. That's walking into the unknown, walking into the darkness, only having the pale moonlight for your guide, having to rely more on intuition than on knowledge, and balancing those forces. Hod is usually sometimes paired with Netzah, which is Venus, and the two of those represent the emotions and the intellect, with Yesod kind of being the intuitive piece in the middle of those two. But if this is your first area, then this is the first deception that you can run into on the path. So to me, I feel like Eisheth is probably more connected to Yesod, at least in the Qlippothic sense. She's on that. She's part of that Qlippoth that is connected to that particular aspect. At the same time, we can see where she would also fit in the Satariel Qlippoth towards the top of the tree, because Bina and Hokmah, to a certain degree, have to do with manifestation. It's interesting because in tarot, Bina is often associated with the high priestess, but she can also be associated with the empress, because she's number 3. Certainly in Crowley's system, she's referred to as number 3. But Arthur Edward Waite tends to put her as the high priestess. But nonetheless, it's this idea of manifesting unconscious energy into something that is created. If the magician has the energy of manifestation, then it still comes from that container, that void of the priestess, or of the empress, maybe even two of them combined in some way to bring about that manifestation into the world, which again, we have this idea of mercy and severity on both sides. So we have these ideas of almost divine judgment. And then we have Tiferet, which is kind of that culmination center point. Then you get into the lower tree, which has to do, again, with reason, emotions, and intuition. And then we have, of course, the kingdom, which is Malkut. I should also note, by the way, that Yesod in those areas are the places that are associated with the realm of Shekinah, which is the feminine divine. I mean, okay, Jewish scholars will tell you that Shekinah is not female. The presence of God isn't female, but Shekinah is a female word. And it's sort of that divine sparks of female presence that are present in the lower half of the tree. And that also sounds very, very Orphic, because in the Orphic cosmogony, the divinity that's present in the world is a result of Dionysus being killed and eaten by the Titans. And then when Zeus Dionysus is rescued and resurrected, okay, through saving his heart. But then Zeus reduces the Titans to ashes with his thunderbolt, and they are reborn. Humans come out of that who have this kind of filth associated with them of the Titans, who are probably more in this kind of reckoning or would be more the Qlippothic forces. But then they have the divine sparks that we have from the Shekinah that are left in this worldly realm. So even though there has been a separation between the top and the bottom, certainly in Jewish thinking, or this separation between divinity and mortal, or as the philosophers would see it, what aspect of humans who are just so great because of their intellect, so therefore there must be a spark of divinity there. And then of course this is where we get around to comparing gods to humans and so forth. But then there's also that very base part of us as well, right? So we can see where a lot of this can come together in a system like this. And this idea of these kind of shards of divinity, if you will, that run through. But one thing about Eisheth that I find really interesting is this description of her as having I love this, she has red hair. So that also connects her with fire, right? If you think about Queen of Wands energy in the tarot, I mean, that's fire energy. And then she turns into a being of fire. So it's almost like this being of fire who goes from being seductive to being terrifying. Because fire can inspire, it can also burn up. It's almost a representation of the soul is the way I look at it. Because that's the way Jung also describes the anima. She has this very fiery kind of inspiration, but she can also be very destructive to the person. She has all these different aspects. So, and she has this beauty. She has this sort of Egyptian and the powers of Eastern lands, which is interesting. And again, from a Judaic point of view, that would have been these are the more materialistic cultures. These would have been the more sinful cultures, right? And her mouth is comely, but her tongue is as sharp as a sword, okay? And there again, if we go back, that's Queen of Swords energy. That's the woman who is, who has a sharp intellect, sharp critique, sharp tongue. But her speech is as smooth as oil at the same time. And so when we think of something being oily, we think of it as being seductive and of course manipulative in its own way. And she wears purple, of course, the regal purple, and has 40 decorations less 1. Okay, you'll have to look up the Kabbalah on number 39, because I noticed that. I was like, there's probably another connection there. But I have not looked it up at this point, so I don't want to try to misrepresent that. Sweeter than all that is sweet in this world. So in other words, this idea of this femininity that's actually going to bring you to your destruction, bring you to Gehenna. It reminds me of the passage in Proverbs about the loose, or actually depending on the translation is loose or foreign, okay? Woman who will guide the man down to Sheol, okay? It's interesting how they equated foreign women with prostitutes, right? But the loose woman is equated with the prostitute here. And the idea, again, of the sexual female as being dangerous to, would really, it's weird because that sexual female probably is an embodiment of the soul, but somehow she's a danger to your soul at the same time. So, I don't know. But of course, obviously, the Kabbalists are not thinking in Jungian terms, but have this idea of the female who is fiery, who is independent, who is in control, who is sexual. If we look at the other aspects of these prostitute wives of Samael, you've also got Lilith, who of course wants sexual equality. That's really what her sin is, where she tells Adam, "Why should you be on top?" And then God says, "Well, yes, he should be over you," and she does like, "No, he shouldn't," and she leaves. So you have this idea of rebellion, independence. And sex for its own sake, not necessarily sex for reproduction, which it seems to be a big thing that people have. That it's weird because we're not supposed to be like the animals, but at the same time we should only be using sex to reproduce. So that's another kind of curious thing to think about when we think about the morality that surrounds sexuality. But anyway, I don't want to go off too far afield with this. I think suffice to say that Eisheth is interesting in how she represents this whore of Babalon, which we could see embodied in both Babalon and Nuit potentially in Thelemic thinking, and how there seems to be qualities of her both in Bina and Yesod, or actually in the Qlippothic equivalents that are connected to Satariel and Gamaliel in the Qlippoth, and her role in people who are trying to find their way on the path of dissolution, becoming more and more mired in the material world. Okay, I think that's really what you want to take away from that there, that the path of Hashem is the path to dissolution again. It's the path back to that limitless light and away from incarnation as such. Is the way that this represents, but she is the sort of the first obstacle on that path, because she, through her beauty, brings people back into worldly desire. But again, then there becomes the alchemical / tantric question as to whether or not one. I mean, there's still the reality that the tree of life is one, which means both the Sephirotic side and then the Qlippothic side, and also the upper and the lower part of the tree. It's not like, one part is bad and unholy and the other's good. I mean, it's one. It's all holy, which is the main idea of Tantra as well. So it's very interesting to consider the way that this feminine figure fits in, not only in biblical thinking, but also in what we think of as esoteric Judaism, and how she ends up being, how she's construed as this kind of temptation and evil, and the way that what we see, at least early 20th century and maybe late 19th century occultism, picking up basically the same script as the biblical script. We're striving to purify ourselves of the elements of the Qlippoth, but the Qlippoth's also part of the equation. So the question is then, what do you do with it? And it goes back to what we said about Echidna. I mean, this is the filth. This is the raw material with which we're able to make everything else, or manage to have the potential to fuse that masculine and feminine. I think probably not enough is thought about what goes on the flip side of the tree, and how that relates to what goes on in the front side. I mean, again, in that way of thinking, anything on the flip side has to do with destruction, but destruction also has a place in creation. So that's about it for me for this week. I want to thank you so much for listening. Thank you once again to my patrons, who I thanked at the beginning of this episode. If you would like to join me, now there's free joining. You can join for free. I'm going to try to have a few community posts here and there, although most of my posts are going to be for paid subscribers. But you can go to patreon.com/Chthonia, and you can sign on for free. But of course, you're going to get much better content if you are a paid subscriber. I mean, like I said, I'm going to try to put a few messages out here and there for the general public, but it's mostly going to be stuff that I'm doing for subscribers. But do feel free to check in. Maybe you can see what the locked posts are and see whether or not that kind of material interests you, and whether or not you'd want to become a paid subscriber if you're not already. You can find me on social media at Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter, X, whatever it is, and Instagram, 2 words on Facebook. And of course, my website is chthonia.net. Thank you so much for listening. Till the next episode.